Hello, my name is David Wellman, and I have the honor of being the director of the Grace School of Applied Diplomacy here at DePaul University. And today I am sitting here with two very dynamic young citizen diplomats who have just spent the last month being practitioners and residents at the Grace School. As Mohamed Abubakr, the president of the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project based in Washington, D.C., and Ilja Sichrovsky, the Secretary General of the Muslim Jewish Conference based in Vienna. Welcome, gentlemen. I'd like to begin with a question about unfolding events and your respective organizations' response to them. Obviously, the big story right now is the unfolding war in Sudan. The African Middle Eastern Leadership Project has been known for creating a network of millennial leaders across Africa and the Middle East. And I'm wondering, how is your network responding to unfolding events in Sudan?
Thank you, David. Right now, the entire ML community, staff, board, and volunteers are all mobilized in two priority areas. Number one of which is evacuation, conducting evacuation of activists, of our staff, as well as of vulnerable minorities, religious and sexual minorities, that we think might be extra vulnerable to becoming victimized by this war. The other area, priority area that we are trying to do some impact on is the macro level picture, trying to stop and nip this war in the bud, because it's what we have seen thus far is definitely not the worst it can get.
It's my understanding that you're not only helping to evacuate Sudanese nationals, you're also helping Americans and others on the ground.
Yes, American citizens as well as citizens of any other country. If you're a stranger in the land, you are a lot more likely to be in the crossfire simply because you don't know the landscape as well. So, yeah, that is definitely a priority group.
So in the midst of all of these conflicts, transitions, moments of democracy, and then going back to authoritarian governments, I understand that underneath all that, there have been a lot of citizen leadership on the ground that has really constituted a different form of leadership in Sudan. And I understand that young people have been playing a very, very important role in that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I mean, young people are known to be, the leaders of this revolution, especially young women. But not really, that's not where their role ended. The morning after the dictator was ousted, they were ready to assume leadership, and they did. The neighborhood committees that they established as part of the movement building has been the de facto government, the de facto service providers and security providers to the communities nationwide. They have organized themselves in a very impressive order and kept communication channels nationally open, and even came up with their own charter, which is a very sophisticated document that represents the closest thing Sudan ever had to a Bill of Rights.
That's absolutely phenomenal. I'm struck by the fact that a tremendous amount of diplomacy on the ground must have been taking place to create these networks, to establish means of communication and protocols. How is that done without any centralized leadership?
Gen Z is a very impressive generation. I mean, Sudan is a very diverse place. 50 plus languages, many races, many national belongings within the one state, and yet they managed to cut across all these lines of difference by leveraging their Gen Z identity in a way. They all grew up with very similar influences in their lives, including the TikTok and social media, and the spirit of their revolution was definitely of a global generation, not of a nationalistic movement.
So then we could say basically that a language already existed, and these young people are leveraging extant ways of communicating and understanding each other.
Absolutely, and I think the whole movement for democracy helped them realize how nationally and internationally alike they are, and there is a lot of power in that.
So for a lot of non-Africans who are not really familiar with the demographics of Sudan, it's my understanding that the vast majority of people in Sudan are very young. What is the age group that generally predominates there?
Like most of African states, more than 70% of the population is under the age of 35. In Sudan, the median age is just above 18 years old. It's a very young nation, and with that amount of youth energy, there is a lot of creativity flowing all over.
It strikes me that given the age of the people that are doing this organization and the age of the people on the ground, that very age is going to be the one that resonates with the vast majority of people, of the population of Sudan.
Absolutely. I mean, you cannot have so many young people pushing in the same direction, all at the same time screaming the same message, and not be humbled as an older generation or as a leadership that is supposedly representative of that population.
So I think it's safe to say probably then, when this war is over, and I very much hope that comes much sooner than later, that these young people who are in neighborhood committees and are working as they are probably likely going to emerge from that group the future leaders of the nation of Sudan.
Absolutely, and we cannot keep using the same language of inclusion that we use here in America or in Europe. Having youth in positions of leadership is, in fact, democracy when it comes to countries in Africa, and we really need to prioritize youth, not include them.
Well, on this subject of youth, I'd like to turn now to asking you a few questions, Ilja. The Muslim Jewish Conference has established itself as a youth-led group, and the raison d'etre of your organization is to bring young Muslims and Jews together to create friendship networks and to work together on any number of different projects. I'm curious, given the fact that while your organization has connectivities in many countries around the world, 65 if I'm not mistaken. I'm wondering if we could focus just for a moment on what's unfolding in Europe right now. And I'm wondering, how do you see the work of the MJC responding to the rise of illiberal democracy in the EU?
Thank you, David, and thank you also for this opportunity. I think in our experience, we are getting out-organized by those forces that are anti-democratic and that build their policy upon fear. And I think it is our job to try to build innovative networks of cooperation amongst those who realize that you need to work beyond borders, beyond differences, and find a compromise to do together what's necessary.
What's always struck me is a certain irony that we have the propensity to believe that it is state-sponsored diplomats are always going to be in the strongest position to address unfolding major problems. And yet, as I look across Europe, I see authoritarian movements leveraging fear of difference, fear of the other on the ground. We can see that in France, we can see that in Hungary, we can see that even in Germany. And yet, I don't see state-sponsored diplomats being able to respond to this in a comprehensive way. However, organizations like the MJC, Coexiste, Amal, are groups on the ground that are actually disabusing people of this myth that there is a reason to fear people who are different. And in that regard, I see the work of citizen diplomacy as actually making the biggest contributions to the future of the EU and its stability. Do you think that is too of a far-fetched or too of a hyperbolic conclusion to make?
I think it's not my role to analyze our position in the bigger picture. I know that our job is to connect action, and it's our job to do that on a regional level. It's our job to do that on a local level. We have to also do that on a national level and on an international level. And we have been doing that. If we look at our International Muslim Jewish Conference, which is taking place every year, we have brought together, I think, more than 1,500 attendees from more than 65 countries. We have held the conference in 13 different cities, or 13 different editions in 5 different cities. So I think we have proven through international engagements, but also through multinational alumni projects like the Coalition for Combating Hatred, as well as local projects like the Muslim Jewish Festival or the Muslim Jewish Film Festival, which invited a Holocaust survivor to talk about her experiences, that we are able to mobilize youth both on a national level, on an international level, but also, and very importantly, on a local level. And so I think our answer is a very simple one. So we stick to the simple solutions, and that's don't complain, organize.
So having had the privilege of attending a couple of MJC gatherings, what struck me is that you're bringing people together not only under the auspices of promoting religious diversity, pluralism, and understanding, but you're also bringing together people of different races, different economic classes, different nationalities, and different ages. When you began this organization, did you imagine that you would actually be facilitating the building of bridges between all of those different groups, even though you began thinking about just Muslims and Jews?
Absolutely not. And I think it was our experience to see that once you create a safe space, if you're actually able to do it, it attracts a lot more agents of change that need that safe space in order to go into dialogue with each other. So it was not just Muslims and Jews who seeked out the Muslim-Jewish conference in order to have a dialogue. It was also LGBTQ activists. There was people who wanted to be active in their political movements on the ground and really just connect actions. I think that's been our driver of change. That's been our mission statement to some extent. And I'm proud that we have become a place where not just a big variety of Muslims and Jews, but also just a big variety of activists did find a home and did declare it as a safe space, which is worth going to and identifying common ground to work upon each other, to work with each other.
Now, given the fact that neither Muslims nor Jews are a majority on the European continent, what do you think are the particular and special insights that non-dominant groups have that perhaps dominant groups might not have with regards to what needs to be done in the future to build a safer, more pluralistic, and more cooperative Europe?
I think especially in the case of the Muslim and the Jewish community, there is an interesting situation that you are talking about a majority community as well as a minority community. So the experience of being a majority is well established within that religion as well as being a minority. And I think the Jewish perspective of having been a minority for most of its time, but now also being in the position of a majority, gives a very interesting mixture of challenges and experiences to our existence. Especially in Europe, I think it's a new mix and dynamic where majority and minority are kind of coupled together in many situations. And it just shows that the continent, as well as many other situations and societies, become multicultural and multinational. And we have to find a language in order to bring people into dialogue and into a constructive dialogue.
It really strikes me that some of the discourse in the far right in Europe, and certainly here in the United States, is somehow referencing a past that never existed. That somehow everything was fine when a particular dominant group was in charge. And yet I look at your group, I look at both of your groups, and I see reflections of reality. I see highly diverse groups of people being incredibly creative. I see young people at the forefront. And I'm just wondering how the work that you do can somehow be a constructive invitation to people who do not necessarily get to go to an MJC conference, that this is really the future of how we're looking at how we're going to live together.
I think giving those tools to organize, to grassroots and lay lead activists is really something where we can change the tide or change at least the trajectory of where things are going. Most of the time when we started this work, we did not know how to talk to diplomats. We did not know how to approach donors. We did not know how to maneuver the field of politics, especially in the Muslim and Jewish realm, which are not the most easy ones to maneuver. So it was self-taught, and we mostly learned through mistakes. Having somebody who teaches you those steps and who guides you through this world is, I think, one of the biggest advantages that we can give young activists in this field, so they don't replicate the mistakes that we made, and they can agree together to fight plastic in the Mediterranean, even if they disagree on many of the political developments that they face.
So you mentioned, of course, one of the most important topics of the conversations that we've been having during your residency here at DePaul, and that is the interface of grassroots activists and state-sponsored diplomats. And I'm wondering, in the course of both of your work, let's turn right now to Mohamed, if I may, for a moment. In the course of your work, how do you see the relationship that currently exists between state-sponsored diplomats and citizen diplomats, the kind that you work with, and what do you think are some of the most important steps that need to be taken to deepen that relationship?
I would say the relationship could be better, could be a lot better, actually, and it begins with strengthening the direct relation and cultivating relations between state-sponsored diplomats and citizen diplomats. For that to happen, we really need to disabuse ourselves from this idea that they are inherently different kind of people from different realities and need to be in parallel universes all the time, or even worse, have to be in an adversarial relationship.
I agree with you completely, and I would say that one of the first commonalities that we see between these two groups is objectives. I mean, is it not true that the values and the mission of both a state-sponsored diplomat and a citizen diplomat are not really that dissimilar?
Not at all. If we are to take down the titles and break it to priorities and job descriptions and what they are out to achieve through their work, the similarities are incredibly similar, so much that it's hard to tell which is which without the label.
Now, it's my understanding that you have actually had some very fruitful relationships with diplomatic figures. I'm thinking in particular of a story that you've told me about an ambassador in Europe, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that was at the beginning of my career. Few years, I was only 17 at the time. I really needed to get a human rights mission, a certain report to the ICC, which, the International Criminal Court, and getting my stuff in order was a Herculean mission. If I were to travel to Europe and start doing what I had to do to get that report done and in the right hands, on my own, I probably would never have succeeded. But with the guidance of a certain European ambassador to Sudan that I had cultivated really good relationship with over in the beginning of my career, I got not only the breakdown of step by step on what to do to get from A to Z, but facilitated all the necessary introductions that I needed to get that job done, to be taken seriously.
So this speaks really to a lot of the practical dimensions of the work that you do. And I'm thinking about conversations that we've had this month, Ilja, about the fact that when you put together one of these major conferences, you must work with state-sponsored diplomats in order to obtain the visas that are going to bring people. Tell us a little bit about how that works, and tell me about things that you think need to be done to deepen that kind of interaction with state-sponsored diplomats.
Yeah, I think it was definitely an interesting awakening for us as a grassroots NGO, realizing that if we want to do anything on an international level, and if we want to bring attendees and participants from different countries, we need to organize visas for them. And the only way to organize visas for these attendees and participants is to have a working relationship with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the country that you're organizing this conference in. That was not something that we thought of when we started to seek out dialogue between Muslims and Jews. So I think there are not only one, but several areas where collaboration between state-sponsored diplomats and citizen diplomats can be improved. Visa is definitely one of the most obvious ones, but also including activists and representatives of civil society into representational trips and outreaches, which are usually led by state-sponsored activists or led by ministries of foreign affairs. For example, during a state visit, or for example, during collaborations between the entities, having somebody that introduces you into the relevant contexts in the country that are important for an activist, for somebody who is starting an NGO, who's starting his work, knowing whom to reach out to, whom to ally with, or whom to ask for support in this work, I think is an extremely important advantage to have when starting. And that is very hard to come by if not through working relationships with state diplomats.
So this idea then of revealing, if you will, pulling back the curtain on the part of the state-sponsored diplomats, is going to help citizen diplomats understand the bigger infrastructure of what's going on. Who are some of the players at the top level? I'm wondering if I could just reverse that and ask you, what do you think is the information that citizen diplomats can bring to state-sponsored diplomats that they might be missing because they're looking at situations from a much higher altitude, if you will?
I think the first and foremost information is that many of the activists that start as activists in their either teenage years or college years end up working for ministries of foreign affairs in the end. So for state-sponsored diplomats to understand that these representatives of civil society have a big chance to end up in the same office with them or end up in the same building with them, to become colleagues of them and working together, is something they should keep in mind when starting dealing with civil society from the beginning. And I think that that's also something where they often do not realize potential advisors and insights that civil society can give state-sponsored diplomats, simply because they are in rooms where diplomats cannot enter or are not wanted. So these exchanges of ideas and information, but making a point that sensitive information is excluded from that, and where civil society really needs to stand their ground, not to become an informant of state-sponsored diplomats and keep their safe spaces. But having said that, healthy exchange of information between those two sides is, I think, crucial to build up a strong democracy.
Well, speaking of exchange of information, Mohamed, you have testified on Capitol Hill to congressional hearings. You are a conversation partner with people at the State Department. I'm wondering, from the perspective of a citizen diplomat and being involved with this network as you are on the ground in Sudan right now, what would be a really important piece of information about the reality of modern Sudan that you wish more people at the State Department were aware of today?
I think this is the message I try to always reiterate in all my meetings, not just state, but also Congress and others. Sudan is a very different country from the Sudan that was 5 years ago, mainly because a huge demographic shift happened. A lot of people came of age recently. It changed the very fabric of the country and its values and its priorities, and I'm afraid that administration after administration has been dealing with Sudan as the Sudan of yore, the Sudan of that was put on the sanctions list in 1997. A lot of the people living in Sudan today were not born in 1997 yet. And I'm talking about more than 65% of the population was not even born when the U.S. last engaged with Sudan. I really wish we stop being lazy and re-educate ourselves on states. And this is not true for only Sudan. This is true for much of Africa that went through very similar transformation within the last decade alone.
Well, of course, you're bringing up one of the most important dimensions of both of your work, and that is the rise of young people, their prominence, and the real estate that they occupy at this point in many parts of the world. And on that thing, I'm just wondering if I could ask you, what is your take on this current generation? If you were to try and summarize the worldview or the political predispositions of Generation Z, how would you characterize them today?
Well, I'm personally, and for full disclosure, I'm a very big fan of Gen Z. I think they are the best thing we have done collectively as a human race, is raising this generation. And I think they are the most compassionate, the most tolerant, the most accepting generation that has ever walked this planet. And there is a lot that comes from acknowledging that, including what they can do and what they are ready to do right now.
In one of our classrooms, you actually mentioned that you thought this was the most uniformly globalized of the generations, and you said they had a lot of common touchstones. How would you describe those?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the first time in history, we can actually say, speak in general terms about a whole generation, and the comparison to be valid globally. Again, all of these kids have grown with a lot of, and I'm sorry for using kids, they grew up with the same influences in their lives. They grew up with TikTok and social media, and grew up connected to a lot more than their smaller circles. They have always been, from day one, a global generation. And that has a lot of impact on who they have become, and explains a lot of why their behavior is in a completely other level than any of the other generations. As a millennial myself, I'm very envious of Generation Z, and I really, they are everything I wish I will be when I grow up.
So with all of the dynamism and insights and connectivity of this generation, why does it seem to you that young people have to wait so long to take on leadership positions? What is your assessment of that, Ilja?
I think the requirements that the youth needs to show in order to be taken seriously these days is absolutely unrealistic. The amount of internships, fellowships, and letters of recommendations they need to acquire in order to be taken seriously in a room is an amount that nobody is managing to acquire before the age of 40. And once they're 40, they have nothing to do with youth anymore.
So I recall once in a classroom you were noting and reminding us that the actual founders of the United States were not as old as some people make them out to be. How did you describe that to us?
The founders of this country were a lot younger than a lot of people think they are. And I asked this question a lot to, supposedly, actually to policymakers even, of how old did they think the founding fathers were. They all assumed the average age would have been like 55 to 65. And the reality is, some of the youngest were 18. Hamilton was 21. Like, most of these people were really young, and on the older sides were Jefferson at 39, and the youngest is 17 years old.
So maybe we need to get the cutoff for a congressional office at 40. Once you're 40, you can't serve anymore.
That would be the dream, honestly. Not to be ageist, but the reality is we really need youth energy. It's a very real thing. Experience matters, but experience can also be gained at a much faster pace in today's world. We are not the go-to-the-library generation anymore. They have much better access to a lot of information at the tip of their fingers. People are gaining experience starting 12 now, not 25. We got to keep that in mind and account for their experience and what they can contribute now.
Well, speaking of experience, I just have to say that here the two of you are. You've worked together for many years. You co-chair the Muslim-Jewish Conference together, and yet you are an African Muslim and you are a European Jew. You're not supposed to be working together so closely, let alone be such dear friends. I'm just wondering, what would your observations be to those people who believe that cooperation across multiple boundaries of difference is increasingly unlikely, if not impossible?
Well, I think we have proven at the Muslim Jewish Conference what kind of change can be implemented if you adhere to the revolutionary, groundbreaking, and extremely exotic methodology of talking to each other instead of about each other.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, in a safe space where you can put down all your guards and just explain who you are and what you're out to achieve, and be truthful about that. Just like with state-sponsored diplomats and citizen diplomats, there's a lot of commonality, and I know I share a lot more with Ilja than I share with people who grew up with me, who sat next to me in school. I know that because we're driven by the same values, we have similar priorities in what we are out to achieve in the world, and suddenly labels of Jewish and Muslim and African and European become quite meaningless in this case. Not that identity doesn't matter, it matters where we come from, but they don't matter as much as what we are out to achieve.
Well, this leads me to want to ask you one question. We can talk about the many identities that can be attributed to both of you, but your religious identities and working together make me want to ask you, what is your take on the fact that when people think about Muslims and Jews, they think about conflict, they think about Israel-Palestine, and this is an issue, a very animating issue on many American campuses that have led to a lot of friction and a lot of people in conflict. And I'm wondering, what is your take on the fact that this has become, actually it's not become, it has been a long-standing source of acrimony on many American campuses? What are your words of advice or observations to young people who are involved in these conversations?
I personally, what I observed on US campuses, but also in all intellectual spaces that and liberal spaces, that Israel-Palestine has been turned into some sort of sport, that people compete in a way, and I really am disheartened seeing that. It's okay to be passionate about an issue. It's okay to care so much, but it cannot become just a performative thing. It's almost offensive how performative the issue is, especially on campuses. I really wish that energy is channeled towards speaking to actual Israelis and Palestinians more, and have them being talked to instead of talked about, as Ilja said earlier. And I wish they would take a hint of what is actually helpful directly from them, from their mouth. That is what's not being done. conversations about Israel and Palestine weirdly does not include a lot of Israelis and Palestinians. And that is where I think this whole toxic environment can be fixed. I believe if they were exposed a lot more to reality of Israelis and Palestinians, they would focus a lot more on issues and not on some performative acts and litmus tests that don't mean anything in reality. Reality is people are dying, people are having a hard time crossing a checkpoint, people are having real struggles with occupation, with falling rockets, with it's a real war zone, and it cannot become just an issue where you have to prove your liberalism by embracing one side or other. That is not helpful to anybody. Definitely not to Israelis and Palestinians.
Well, certainly in Muslim Jewish conference spaces, I have met Israelis and Palestinians who are doing all these phenomenal projects together that I think for a greater audience of people would not have imagined. How do you think that those people and their work could be lifted up more and to get more space and more attention so that people could realize that there are many different choices that can be made in this conflict?
I think for us, as the Muslim Jewish Conference, we did not focus our attention so much on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because so many other organizations do. In our opinion, it was important to give space to all the other Jews and Muslims all around the world who have an opinion on the conflict, but need to understand that they can differ in their opinion on the conflict and still find an ally in each other to work towards other issues. As I mentioned before, you can have a different opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you can fight the spread of plastic in the Mediterranean together. You can have a different opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you can fight populistic politics in your home country together. So I think realizing that the other one is not an enemy just because he differs in a political point of view with you may be something that is very dear to your heart. But just realizing that there is a potential ally out there for many of the struggles that you will face in your life. And just because you are not at the same opinion with one very emotional issue potentially does not mean that you have to find an enemy in this other person.
Well, I have to say that speaking of allies, I just want to thank the both of you for being such wonderful allies of the Grace School. It has been such an honor and a privilege to have you with us on this campus and to meet our students. You have been the talk of many conversations here. And I just have to say that I cannot imagine any work that is more vital right now than the work that you are both engaged in. So I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wisdom and your experience with our students. And I look forward to the next time that we could welcome you back. So Mohamed Abubakr, Ilja Sichrovsky, thank you very much.